The mini train keeps on rolling, and I'm beyond excited to make a return to handhelds. This time around we've got a new one from Retroid. It's been a while since we've seen a new one drop from the Retroid crew, with their latest release being the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. And now they're back with a pair of handhelds, the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Retroid Pocket Mini, with the Mini up first and in many ways is the spiritual successor to the Retroid Pocket 2S. The Mini promises to take this form factor to the next level with the inclusion of Qualcomm's Snapdragon 865 and packs it into an itty-bitty living space. It's the first time Retroid has gone with Qualcomm, and it's not the only first here, with the Mini packing a beautiful 3.7-inch OLED display and a new design language that feels premium and offers ergonomics never before seen on a Retroid device. There's a lot to talk about here, and I invite you to join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we take our deep dive into the magic of the Retroid Pocket Mini. As we always do, let's roll out the specs for the new Retroid Pocket Mini and unbox the goodness that awaits inside this very familiar cardboard packaging. You know it's gonna be a good day when you see this brown box with a lovingly made in China printed on it. And another familiar sight for those who have purchased Retroid products before, but this time around we have the Mini branding, which lets us know that something different is waiting inside. Now the Mini is bringing a few new things to the table for Retroid, and for starters, the Pocket Mini has a 3.7-inch 4:3 aspect ratio AMOLED display at a resolution of 1280 by 960 with a max 500 nits of brightness, and this is the first time that Retroid is using an AMOLED display in their handhelds. And for another first, the Mini is powered by the Qualcomm Snapdragon 865, which is the first time we're seeing the 865 in a Retroid device, as well as the first time that Retroid is going with a Snapdragon chipset. As a refresher, the Snapdragon 865 is an 8-core chip that clocks up to 2.8 GHz with a Cortex A77 core, and features the Adreno 650 graphics, which should be quite an improvement in terms of driver support from the usual found in Retroid handhelds. The Retroid Pocket Mini comes in only one configuration, with 6GB of LP DDR4X RAM and 128GB of UFS 3.1 internal storage. The Pocket Mini does have the option to expand storage through its microSD slot. We've got Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.1, and a USB Type-C port that supports data, charging, and video out at 1080p 60. Currently, the Retroid Pocket Mini is shipping with Android 10 out of the box. And so at this point, if you are wanting Android 13 support, it's important to be aware that Retroid claims this update will come sometime towards the end of October. Now inside the Mini we have a smaller 4000 mAh battery, but I think with the efficiency of the Snapdragon 865, battery life will actually fare better than expected, which we will talk about more in the usual battery section. The packaging only includes a Retroid branded USB Type-C cable, and there is no power adapter included, but the Mini does support charging at 27 watts. Now outside of the Mini itself and the USB Type-C cable, there's not a whole lot else going on here, but we do have a very brief user's manual which is more like a folded sheet that shows off the interface and specs of the Mini. Oh, and lots of foam inserts. The Mini is available for ordering direct from the Retroid website and is priced at $199 US. The Mini is available in multiple colors including orange, black, SFC, 16-bit, which is the color I have received here, and a Japanese Saturn inspired color, which is the unit that I personally ordered. I'd like to thank Retroid for sending me this review kit for evaluation, and as I always require, this video was not reviewed prior to publishing. So let's get a bit more intimate with the Mini and take a tour around the handheld. I'll start out at the top right corner of the Mini, and we can see we do have the return of the stacked shoulder configuration, with the R1 button that is pretty quiet to press down on and has a subtle clickiness to it. The shoulder button is easily pressed and has a good response to the button movement. The R2 below is a trigger with a decent amount of travel given the size of the handheld. I will say that the shoulder triggers have a bit of a resistance to them, and I'll be curious to see how this affects gameplay long term. Now moving along the top, we have the power button, volume up and down buttons, the exhaust vent for the active cooling that is built into the Mini, and then finally the left side shoulder button and trigger, which feel identical to the ones on the right side. Coming down the left side, there is one very obvious detail here, and you can see the outline of those grips that are built into the Mini, which is a departure from the typical design language of Retroid handhelds and should greatly improve comfort with the Mini. At the bottom we have the micro SD slot, which is protected by a cover that easily pops out. And beside this we have a 3.5mm headset port and then the USB Type-C for data, charging, and video out. Coming up to the right side, and there's nothing to note here, so let's go on and check out the back of the Mini. And now we have a nice look at those bump outs at the bottom, which are part of the grips that Retroid has incorporated into the design of the Mini. At the center, we have the very minimal Retroid branding, and beside that, the intake for the active cooling, which we will take a peek at in just a little bit during the teardown. Let's go front side and take an opportunity to talk about the controls of the Mini. The Mini is using the very well known Retroid D-pad that has been seen in multiple devices of theirs, and as the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And really, the Retroid D-pad is one of my personal favorites in this space to use. This is a Vita-inspired D-pad, but it has phenomenal movement, pivot, and responsiveness, and it is just an absolute joy to use. I tested it with my usual Marvel vs. Capcom 2 test using the PS2 version this time around, and I had no issues pulling off combos in succession, moving all over the screen, and regardless of direction, the inputs registered as expected. I know that D-pad on top stands will absolutely be overjoyed that Retroid has placed these where they are. Now, another mainstay of Retroid devices has been the newer analog sticks from Jinful that have a much better range of movement than the Switch-style sticks that we typically see in other handheld devices. Retroid made the Switch these analog sticks last year, and these massively improve the experience when using analog controls. These actually don't sit too much above the face of the device, and I don't think it will impact its pocketability, so it's a nice inclusion since these are so greatly improved. I do like that they are further inset than the face buttons and D-pad, and so when you're resting your thumbs on the stick, it doesn't feel too awkward. And then we have the face buttons, which are set up in the Nintendo-style BAYX configuration, and we will be examining the ability to switch the face buttons to the Xbox-style layout, as well as some other things during the teardown. The face buttons have a very thunky feel and sound to them, almost kind of like a clackiness. But they do have a pretty good amount of travel, and when pressed fully down, they still sit above the face of the Mini. Now when you're frantically pressing down on the buttons, these are a bit noisier, and even when compared to the Pocket 2S for example, they do seem like they are slightly louder. The buttons themselves also appear to be finished a bit differently than the prior Retroid devices, with it having a very flat top, whereas ones found on the 4 Pro or the 2S for example, have a slight roundedness to them. I'm not sure why Retroid changed the design slightly here, but for the most part they respond the same way, but it was immediately noticeable to me when coming from heavy use with the 4 Pro and the 2S. We also have 4 additional face buttons for Start, Select, Home, and a dedicated back button for Android. These have a very subtle clickiness to them and are pretty quiet. Finally, we have front-firing speakers, and immediately I am so beyond happy that these are in fact front-firing, since the audio experience will be a lot better than something that has down-firing speakers. I will say that these speakers really surprised me with their performance, and when I first received the Mini, the device was actually set to 100% volume, and it was shocking in how loud the device was at that preset. But while these speakers aren't going to blow anyone away, I do think they retain their quality at max volume, scale appropriately, and stay clear at the higher sound levels. Let's listen in on some Marvel vs. Capcom 2. And then we have the display, which is easily one of the highlights here. Now I know many are disappointed that it's not slightly larger since the Mini display comes in at 3.7 inches. But the display is such a welcome addition with it being an AMOLED panel that looks fantastic, and given the screen size as well as that resolution of 1280 by 960, really gives it a very sharp image coming in at about 432 ppi, which is really solid. The picture is stunning, and at times I just take a moment to enjoy the display, which many times feels like a screenshot that has been superimposed on the Mini, since it looks so clear and sharp, especially with the glass front. The viewing angles are excellent regardless of how you hold the handheld, and the colors and contrast are phenomenal, with of course the excellent black levels that are expected of an AMOLED display. The brightness scaling is as expected, with it getting fairly bright at the top end of about 500 nits, which certainly isn't ode to mini bright, but I think for most this is more than enough, and the device does scale down nicely for those that game at night, getting very dim at the lowest end. For me personally, I love that this is a 4:3 aspect ratio display, and with it being AMOLED, it's a treat to revisit many generations of gaming since the 4:3 aspect ratio will be quite good for many platforms, including higher end ones like PlayStation 2 and GameCube, which will look stunning here. And for those that don't want to deal with widescreen hacks or having borders at the sides, this is the handheld to get for 4:3 content. And speaking of borders, I know that some have commented that getting the handheld in black will mean that you probably won't need those borders for the games with different aspect ratios because it will probably just blend right in with the front, and so it's definitely something to think about if you're unsure of which color to get. And this actually seems like a good segue into just the overall build quality and comfort. Now, I mentioned that the black could be a good option for those that want to blend the AMOLED display with the front of the device. But fingerprints will definitely be a concern, and I recommend checking out videos of the black unit in action. I said earlier that I personally ordered the white Saturn model, and the unit I have in hand for this review is the gray 16-bit model, which does a great job of minimizing visible fingerprints because of the gray finish. Now, there is a reason for all of this talk about the colors, which leads directly into one of my first thoughts about the build quality, and it's a fairly noticeable one, with this beautiful all-glass front, which is very reminiscent of Aya Neo in styling and does give the Retroid Pocket Mini a sophisticated look, very much a departure from prior devices like the Retroid Pocket 2S. And the finishing overall on the handheld is very good, from the front glass of the shell to the back plate with its rounded bump outs for improved comfort and ergonomics, which is another noticeable departure coming from the flat slates typical of Retroid designs seen in handhelds like the Pocket 3 and Pocket 4. The plastic feels really great in the hands, and I love how Retroid thoughtfully concealed the screws for the backplate by placing them at the top and bottom, instead of the usual placement in the back shell, which allows the Mini to keep its overall smoothness, again lending to its improvements in comfort. The Mini is a device that is built well, with premium components from the AMOLED display to the Jinful analog sticks. Of course, I do have some complaints, and the face buttons for me are a bit thunkier than I'd like to see, especially when compared to prior Retroid devices. I also noticed that the buttons seem to scrape against the front of the shell, as evidenced by the markings left behind on the sides of the buttons. But I will say that when I'm playing, I actually don't feel this myself, and even when looking carefully when pressing down, there appears to be enough clearance. The face buttons to me are a slight downgrade from prior Retroid devices, mostly because of that louder thunk to them. The ergonomics are fantastic, especially when your hand fully grips the handheld with your thumbs firmly placed on the D-pad and face buttons, and it's probably the most comfortable of placements with the Mini. The added grip and ergonomics is definitely a very welcome addition, and looking at the Retroid Pocket 2S, it makes a lot of sense that they went ahead and added that extra rounded bump out at the bottom for the Mini, since we are already getting a bit of a bump out thanks to the triggers. I will say that it's not all perfect here, and I definitely experienced some fatigue, especially with those triggers, which are a bit stiffer and have some resistance to them, making games that rely on those analog triggers a bit tiring for long-term sessions. Now, I can comfortably grip the Mini with my fingers around the triggers. The problem for me is that my fingers want to move out to press down on them, since they do require a bit more effort, and so I do need to adjust my grip in order to use those triggers. So let's go ahead and do a few comparisons to some devices that are similar in price point, as well as size, and mostly have the 4:3 aspect ratio. First up, let's grab the Retroid Pocket 2S, which the Mini is sort of the spiritual successor to, but Retroid says that the Mini is really not meant to be a direct follow-up to it. Regardless, it's an interesting one to compare to, since if you take a look here, the Retroid Pocket 2S and the Mini are quite comparable in size. The Mini does have a slightly larger display at 3.7 inches versus the 3.5 inches on the 2S. And I really hate to do this to any fans of the 2S, including myself, but the Mini's display is just a night and day difference, and it really lets you appreciate just how nice the screen is here. The Pocket 2S and the Mini share the same D-pad, analog sticks, as well as very similar face buttons, but the design language, as I mentioned before, is such a contrast to the older 2S design. On the side, we can see how the Mini nicely incorporates the grips at the bottom, and again, it doesn't do it at the expense of losing out on its pocketability. You can see how the 2S and the Mini are nearly identical at the point where the shoulder triggers are. And at the back, the roundedness of the Mini definitely lends to its curves and ergonomics. The Mini is a remarkably small device, given what we're working with here. Let's now compare to a few Anbernic devices, and first up we've got the Big Chunker, the recently released RG406V, and this is a vertical handheld, but is certainly larger than the Mini, and partly due to having a larger 4-inch screen. And in various orientations, we can see that the RG406V's size just dwarfs the Mini. If a compact device is a priority, the RG406V is probably not going to be your ideal choice. It's interesting to note that both handhelds are the 16-bit inspired gray, but they both have very different tones of gray, which is definitely interesting to see side by side here. We can also see that despite the RG406V having a slightly larger screen by 0.3 inches, it does visually look much larger and does make a difference here. I will say that the RG406V has a really great screen as well, and if size is not a priority, This is when a device like the RG406V becomes appealing. Now for another Anbernic device, I think many will be comparing the Mini to the RG Cube, which like the RG406V has the Unisoc TA20, and we will definitely see how performance fares for that during the benchmark portion coming up in just a little bit. The RG Cube is just slightly less wide than the Mini, but it is a taller device naturally since it does have a 4-inch 1:1 aspect ratio display. And what's interesting here, and why I wanted to include this device, is that 4:3 content on the RG Cube will actually be slightly smaller on the Cube than on the Mini. And again, we can definitely appreciate just how much nicer the display is here on the Mini compared to the RG Cube, which is definitely washed out in comparison. The RG Cube is slightly thicker at the grips, which come out more on the device, and is a bit narrower in comparison. We can definitely see this when both devices are on their sides with a more pronounced grip on the RG Cube. And I've got one last Anbernic device with the RG405M. It's a bit older device, releasing more than a year ago, but still a fan favorite, and it's a beautifully made handheld. The RG405M does pack a larger 4-inch 4:3 aspect ratio display, but amazingly it does it being almost identical in terms of height and width compared to the Mini. It's also a very thin and flat device with not much in the way of ergonomics when compared to the Mini, and it will be interesting to see if Anbernic ever plans on updating this specific model in the future, which in terms of power is going to be very much behind what the Mini offers here. And lastly, for fun, I do think it's worth just showing the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro here briefly, which is a 16:9 aspect ratio handheld and does have a direct successor launching later this month with the Retroid Pocket 5. I always found the 4 Pro to be a very compact device, and having it beside the Mini, I think it does help drive home just how compact the Mini is, and we will find out shortly that the Mini is as powerful, or perhaps more powerful than even the 4 Pro here, and so the Mini, despite the smaller footprint, isn't suffering in terms of performance and is very much a pocketable device, even more so than the 4 Pro. So let's pull back the curtain and go deeper with a teardown of the Retroid Pocket Mini, so that we can take a look at a few things, including the ability to swap the face buttons. As I mentioned earlier, there was clearly some thought put into the design, and we only have 4 screws holding the back shell into place, and these are not on the back as is typical for so many handhelds. Let's go ahead and grab a Phillips head size 00, which seems to be a good fit for these screws, and go ahead and remove them quickly. Don't forget to remove your microSD card as well. The backplate is going to be held into place with retention tabs, and let me tell you, this shell is very secure and will require a bit of patience to get it separated. I also wanted to take my time to find a good spot to get a bit of separation to then work my way around the Mini without damaging the shell. I did find a good spot right by the R1 button and used a pick to then slowly make my way across to get those tabs separated just enough so that I can then get the rest of it off without the need for a tool. Nice and easy, going all the way around, and once the back shell pops off, there is no need to be concerned about anything connected to the backplate, so there's actually no risk of accidentally prying off any cables and whatnot. We've got a fairly rigid piece of plastic here for the backplate, and surprisingly, there's no screen here to protect any dust to get into the vents. Okay, so now we've got a nice look at the Mini without the back shell on, and some components that are immediately visible, including those pretty sizable front-firing speakers that are readily accessible right from this point of disassembly. Of course, probably the most notable inclusion here is the active cooling, and this has a fairly sizable fan considering the space we're working with here. We've got a vibration motor right at the center as well. So let's turn this sideways so we can check out the 4000 mAh battery, which despite being visible at this point, is actually not removable and will require a bit more disassembly to gain access to that battery fully. I went a bit out of order for editing, but in order to disconnect the battery, you will need to remove the cooling assembly, and it does require you to break that Retroid sticker that's in place, which in the US is actually not enforceable. Anyways, there are 4 screws holding the fan assembly in place, with one of them sort of tucked away under that black sticker. But once you've got the 4 screws removed and then disconnect 2 of the cables, the fan assembly does come off pretty easily with a thermal pad in place over the chipset, so no worries about messing up any thermal compound. We can now disconnect the battery as needed if you're going to be doing a replacement for it. So let's now go back and pretend that we didn't go out of order and check out the dome switches at the top for the power and volume buttons, as well as a closer look at the Hall effect triggers. So let's go ahead and remove these speakers since they are actually pretty easy to remove and directly accessible. I will make a note that the speakers do not need to be removed in order to gain access to either daughter board on each side, and this is just so that we can take a closer look. We can continue to use the same Phillips head bit to get the speakers out, which are held into place with just 2 screws for both speakers. And here's a closer look at the fairly large speaker. Now, something interesting for the left side speaker, there is an additional cable connected to it, and this is actually the Wi-Fi antenna, so make sure to be careful with this since it is soldered on one end. Let's continue to dive in since one of the things I really want to take a look at are the face buttons here. I have to say I am very impressed by how the internals look, and again you can tell there's just a lot of thought that went into the design. There is a plastic casing that protects the controls on both sides, which does add to the overall rigidity of the device. We will need to remove this shell in order to gain access to the controls, including the analog sticks. This is held into place with 4 additional Phillips screws, one of which is hidden underneath the trigger. So let's quickly remove the 3 easy to access screws and then go ahead and get the shoulder trigger off. The trigger is sort of clipped on and can actually just be popped off, so just try to be as gentle as possible, but it will require a little bit of force. Once it's been popped off, you can see that 4th and final screw. So this is a very interesting design, as this piece of plastic does more than what is let on at first. The actual trigger assembly is part of this piece, which is noteworthy since it not only serves to secure the device. And we now have our first look at the controls, including the GINFL analog sticks. And before we even do anything with the sticks, let's go ahead and pop off the analog stick cap, which are interchangeable with other Retroid devices like the 2S and 4 Pro. In fact, I have my 2S right here, and I'll go ahead and pop on the black analog stick cap, and as you can see, it works without issue. So as I mentioned, these are GINFL branded and come out pretty easily with just 2 screws to remove here. And don't forget to disconnect the ribbon cable before taking it out. This analog stick is just incredible for its size and range of movement that it provides. The analog stick may be out, but there's a plastic enclosure that again seems to be there to both secure and protect the components. This is held into place with 2 additional screws and will need to be removed in order to gain access to the daughter board that is holding the face buttons in place. Okay, so let's do some cable disconnection, and first we will go with the cable that connects the daughter board to the main board, as well as the cable for the shoulder button, and with that we are now able to free the daughter board from the shell. And here's a nice closer look at the daughter board with the RP marking. But most importantly, we get our first peek at the face buttons. There is a plastic piece still inside the analog stick area, which is there to diffuse the RGB lighting. Okay, so this is pretty weird. Now I was expecting the face buttons to come flying out as I remove the membrane, but these are actually glued down, which I don't think I've ever seen on a handheld device before. And if you notice, I actually pulled the face buttons off camera to get a closer look because I was slightly confused at first. You could definitely see some of that glue visible around the membrane, which looks like some Elmer's school glue. Okay, so it's now time to check out how these face buttons are keyed, and yes, they are uniquely keyed. It just so happens that I have a Retroid Pocket 2S here already disassembled, and I did want to check out compatibility with those face buttons. Unfortunately, these will not work without modifications to the buttons themselves, and are not a direct one-to-one copy. And going back to the Mini, and the same holds true for doing a button layout swap, which will also require modifications in order to get the Xbox style arrangement. At this point, I think I've satisfied most of my curiosities about the internals, and now it's time to see what the Mini can do in terms of performance. And we will first dive into some synthetic benchmarks, and also do some comparisons to similar devices before finally moving on to real-world gaming performance. And while the Snapdragon 865 is not a new mobile chip by any means, it is the first time we are seeing it in a handheld device, and our old friend the Pimax Portal gave us an idea of what we could expect since the Snapdragon XR2 was similar to the 865. But let's see how the 865 fares in the Mini and with the active cooling, as well as Retroid's own performance presets. So first up, let's talk about the Geekbench 6 numbers. And first I will compare the 3 performance presets with the Mini, starting out with the standard preset and the fan disabled. The Mini scored 1211 for the single core score and 3311 for the multi-core score. So let's now bump the Mini up to the performance preset with the quiet fan option and see if we get a bump up in performance. The Mini with the performance preset came in at 1219 for the single core score and 3487 for the multi-core score. So we definitely had a nice uptick in performance on the multi-core side. Finally, let's check out the high performance preset with the smart fan option, and the Mini scored 1221 for the single core score and 3530 for the multi-core score, and we can definitely see that the high performance preset is giving us the most performance with the Mini, coming in at about a 7% increase over the standard one on the multi-core score. Now let's compare the Mini to some other devices. So let's bring over our best numbers from the Retroid Pocket Mini with its Snapdragon 865 and now compare it to the D1100 in the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, and then the Unisoc TA20 found in the RG Cube, RG556, and more recently the RG406V, using the best numbers that I could obtain on those devices. The Retroid Pocket 4 Pro with the Dimensity 1100 came in at 1120 for the single core score and 3668 for the multi-core score. The D1100 brings slightly stronger multi-core performance, but it is behind on the single-core performance against the Snapdragon 865. Now remember, synthetic benchmarks just paint one picture, and of course we will see shortly just how the Snapdragon 865 performs in the real world. Finally, the Unisoc T820 that's found in a number of Anbernic devices came in at 2,385 for the multi-core score, and just 853 for the single-core score, which is behind both the D1100 and Snapdragon 865 by a decent amount, especially for its multi-core performance. To its credit, the T820 is an overachiever and actually does perform surprisingly better than it appears. So let's now check out GPU performance with 3DMark's Wildlife Extreme, and like before, let's compare the performance presets first. The Retroid Pocket Mini with the standard preset and no fan came in at 1,336, and the bump to performance with the quiet fan option and the Mini scored 1,337. And finally, the high performance preset with the smart fan option, which came in at 1,339, which clearly shows us that there's not a whole lot of difference between the GPU performance on these presets. And in terms of the other devices, let's take the Mini's best score of 1,339 and compare it to the best scores that I obtained with the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro up first, and its Dimensity 1100 coming in at 1,272, and the RG Cube with its Unisoc T820, which came in at 570. The Snapdragon 865's GPU is clearly the winner here, and especially so when compared to the T820 with almost an increase of 135% over the T820. Finally, let's look at the Antutu benchmark for an idea of overall performance. The Retroid Pocket Mini with the standard preset and no fan achieved an overall score of 770,128. Now moving to the performance preset with the quiet fan option, and the Mini scored an overall score of 773,298. And finally, using the high performance preset and the smart fan option, the Mini scored an overall score of 778,395. Much like with the other benchmarks, we're seeing that the differences between the performance presets with the Mini aren't as significant as one might expect, and I bet that for most scenarios, the standard preset will be the way to go. And of course, here are the comparisons to the other devices using the best overall score of the Retroid Pocket Mini, with their Retroid Pocket 4 Pro's D1100 coming in at an overall score of 717,499, which is slightly behind the Snapdragon 865. And finally, here is the RG Cube with the T820 that came in with an overall score of 485,086, and continues the narrative from the other benchmarks, with the T820 falling way behind the other chipsets, and the Snapdragon 865 is for the most part edging out the D1100 in each benchmark, at least in terms of synthetic numbers. Finally, I did want to briefly show off the thermal stability with the Mini using the 3DMark Wildlife Extreme stress test to demonstrate that the active cooling in the Mini is actually providing some benefit to the device. Here's the standard performance preset without the fan turned on, which had a stability percentage of 91.8%. And then when I ran the same test with the fan turned back on, the Mini was able to achieve a 99.8% stability, which shows that the fan is definitely helping stabilize the temperature on the Mini, though I will say that a 91.8% score is still pretty impressive on its own. I also sort of accidentally captured this in real world performance when I was doing my battery testing with God of War 2, which I first wanted to see if I could get away with using the standard performance preset without the fan turned on, and the device definitely started to thermal throttle because performance was not at a full 60 frames per second. But when I ran the same test with the fan on, God of War 2 was able to get through its entire battery testing without any thermal throttling, so it definitely shows that the fan is doing its job. So it's finally time to jump into some gaming, since that's what this Mini was designed to do. But first, let's talk about some native Android games, and it's something that I feel many overlook when it comes to these Android-based handhelds. And I've been trying to spread awareness of the Android's library since there are quite a number of great games that receive native ports to the platform. I have an entire video series dedicated to it, and I definitely recommend checking them out and giving some of those games a try. Now with the Snapdragon 865, performance for native Android games should be quite good, and the neat thing about a lot of Android games is that they will scale appropriately to fit the 4:3 aspect ratio display. Now this is not the case for all games, and some will have letterboxing at this aspect ratio, but I wanted to feature a few games, and first up, I thought it would be neat to check out some Diablo Immortal on this device. And I couldn't believe how well it performed here with all the settings essentially maxed out here, and it runs really well. And there's something so fun about seeing Diablo Immortal running this well on a device this small, especially with dedicated controls. Now for an awesome premium game, not many know that Thumper received a port to the Play Store, and this is an excellent port that not only performs well here on the Snapdragon 865, but also scales properly and looks absolutely gorgeous on the Mini's display thanks to the OLED panel, and is a very good showcase of it. And of course, I have to feature a racing game for this part of the video, but instead of going with Horizon Chase, I wanted to feature Rush Rally 3, which is a great rally racing game that is a premium experience as well as part of the Google Play Pass. I have Rush Rally 3 at the 928p resolution with very high settings, a 60 frames per second target, and the Mini is set to use the standard quiet presets, and the game is performing very well. Now let's head back into the free-to-play world and check out some popular games in that space. I wanted to test Call of Duty Warzone, but I kept getting just a black screen, and so I couldn't get it to work for this video. I'm hoping that when the Android 13 build drops for the Mini, this issue will be corrected. So instead, let's check out another fun shooter that I like to jump into and play from time to time with some Star Wars hunters. I am in particular impressed by how well this game is running here, and I have it set to use the ultra visual quality, FXAA anti-aliasing, 100% fixed resolution scale, and the 60 frames per second target using the standard preset with the quiet fan option, and the game is very smooth with full controller support. And let's wrap this segment up with another popular free-to-play game, and one that has full controller support now as well. Wuthering Waves definitely surprised me by how well it is running here, and it's awesome that it automatically detects the built-in controls of the Mini. Now, I was definitely testing my aging eyes here, since while this game does scale appropriately to the Mini's 4:3 aspect ratio display, we are definitely pushing the limits of what is readable on a display of this size. Regardless, this is pretty fun to see here, and I have Wuthering Waves set to a medium graphics quality target and 60 frames per second, and it's doing very well here. So it's time to move into the world of emulation, and let me tell you, the Snapdragon 865 is no slouch when it comes to performance, and despite the age of the chipset, this is a real treat to have in a device this small. The driver support alone will be much improved over the Unisoc and MediaTek options that we've seen in the past, and so in many ways this is setting a new standard for this size, form factor, and price point. And I have to say that the Snapdragon 865 is a great balance between price and performance, and if you remember, I mentioned that I purchased the Saturn color for my own personal unit because I have the full intention of making the Mini my portable Sega Saturn device, and what an absolute joy it is to play Saturn on here with Yaba Senshiro set to use the device's resolution of 1280 by 960, and the games look absolutely stunning on here, but most importantly, performance is excellent, and really the only limitation is the emulator itself. I have the Mini set to use the standard performance preset with the quiet fan option. You can probably see on screen that I've tested quite a number of Saturn games, and there were so many wonderful games, especially when you start to add in the Japanese titles. I can't believe how good Panzer Dragoon looks on here, and one of my favorite racing games ever, Sega Rally Championship, is having no issues with the Mini. And of course, I couldn't resist and had to load up some Radiant Silvergun to get that shmup goodness, and again, it's just a real treat. I am even more excited now to receive the Mini in the Saturn color. This is truly a dream come true for a Sega Saturn fan like myself. Now, given the performance of the Sega Saturn, that tells us that the other 5th generation consoles will perform incredibly well. And for PlayStation 1, I am set to use 5 times the native resolution, which is the equivalent of 1080p, and honestly completely overkill given the 1280 by 960 panel here on the Mini using the standard preset with the quiet fan option, and you can see that I picked 900 to demonstrate since the colors and contrast are unbelievable here, and I am blown away that this is a PlayStation 1 game running here. Nintendo 64 is much of the same story, and harder to run games like Yoshi's Story, for example, are having no issues, but I wanted to showcase a different game. And here I have Goemon's Great Adventure running at a resolution of 1440 by 1080 using the standard preset with the quiet fan option, and it's having no issues staying locked to its target frame rate. And again, much like PlayStation 1, I'm finding myself just admiring and enjoying the beautiful visuals on display here with the Mini. So let's check out some more Sega consoles, and we've got the Dreamcast, and of course, I couldn't help myself and I had to load up some Cosmic Smash, since I immediately thought of how great this game would look on the OLED panel here with the Mini. Dreamcast actually scales at a 2 times resolution that matches the Mini's panel at 1280 by 960, and the Mini is set to use that standard preset with the quiet fan option, and of course it's not having much issue running the game, and so we can definitely enjoy Dreamcast with some upscaling, and it's going to look fantastic on this display. And for Cosmic Smash in particular, the levels that have the black backgrounds are going to really stand out and look super nice on here. And for another game that has kind of a similar vibe to it, here is Rez, which as many longtime viewers know on the channel how much I love Rez, and some of the other games from Tetsuya Mizuguchi. This was a game that I immediately thought of when thinking about games that would look good with the OLED panel here on the Mini, and it is another great showcase of the OLED panel. Obviously, something like Dreamcast will have no issues working here with the Mini, and so I think it's time to take it a step up and check out some GameCube and PlayStation 2 emulation. Now, without a doubt, I think for many the biggest appeal of a device like the Mini with the Snapdragon 865 is being able to play the 6th generation of consoles like the GameCube and PS2. Now, just the idea of being able to play GameCube and PlayStation 2 games this well in a device this compact is very exciting, and for me personally so much fun to see. I am happy to report that the Snapdragon 865 is doing very well with GameCube emulation using the Dolphin emulator from the Play Store, and it really is only limited by the emulator itself more than the actual performance available with the chipset here. For GameCube emulation, I wanted to feature games that were different than the usual, and so let's start out with some Beautiful Joe, and this is a game that has absolutely stunning art, and with some upscaling will let the game really come through, especially with the excellent contrast here on the mini display. For Beautiful Joe, I am set to 4 times the native resolution of GameCube, which is probably overkill for this display, but let me tell you, the visuals clean up so nicely with this game, and it really does let this game come through. The best part is that performance is very good, even at 4 times the resolution, using just the standard preset with the Quiet Fan option. And for another game that's always fun to check out, here's Soul Calibur 2, and the GameCube version is a lot of fun since it did feature Link as a playable character, whereas the PlayStation 2 and Xbox versions received their own unique characters, and so many really like playing the GameCube version of Soul Calibur 2 for that reason. And much like Beautiful Joe, Soul Calibur 2 is doing very well with Dolphin and the Snapdragon 865, and I have this game set to 4 times the native resolution of the GameCube, and performance is excellent here as well. Finally, I want to check out a game that is a bit trickier to run, and I have Time Splitter's Future Perfect, and for this one you will want to switch to the OpenGL backend, which will give you the best performance with Dolphin, but I am able to get away with a 2 times native resolution of the GameCube, and for this I do have the high performance preset with the Sport Fan option on to get the best performance possible for this game. Time Splitters is a tricky game to run, and so this is pretty nice to see, and at least it lets us brute force some of that performance with the Snapdragon 865. And of course, we can't forget about the Wii when talking about the Dolphin emulator, and so I have a couple of games here that I want to check out. First up, with some Tatsunoko vs. Capcom. The performance here really surprised me. I have a 3 times native resolution upscaling, using the standard performance preset and the Quiet Fan option, and performance is holding on and looking pretty good here, with some occasional dips here and there. Again, I think that the 3 times resolution is probably overkill for a device like this, and you can easily turn it down and give yourself some better battery life. But let me tell you, the visuals are absolutely stunning at this upscaling. And lately I've been enjoying featuring the Call of Duty games that actually released on the Wii, since I don't think that many know that there were quite a few Call of Duty games that received ports to the console, and a lot of them were actually very solid ports. This time around I have Call of Duty Black Ops, and this is actually one of my favorite Call of Duty games, and this one supports the classic controller, so you can have traditional controls here for this game. And because Call of Duty Black Ops only targets 30 frames per second, we are amazingly able to get away with the same 3 times native resolution, and performance is mostly good here as well, with some dips here and there, and again you can easily drop it down to improve performance as well as battery life. What this shows me is that there's a decent amount of headroom with Wii emulation, and for the most part the library should do well even if we have to go down to native resolution. Now let's switch on over to the Sony side, and without a doubt being able to play PlayStation 2 games on a device this small and this well is a very exciting proposition. I spent a lot of time testing an enormous amount of games for the PlayStation 2 using Nether SX2, and honestly I could easily devote an entire video just to this topic. Long story short is that PlayStation 2 emulation is really excellent on the Mini using the Snapdragon 865. You probably noticed that I have Burnout Revenge running here in the background, and I have this game set to use 3 times the native resolution of the PlayStation 2 using just the standard performance preset and the Quiet Fan option. And for the most part, Burnout Revenge is running very fast and smooth here. Let's check out a little bit of a more problematic game, and Dragon Quest VIII can be a difficult game to run because of certain special effects. Now for this game you need to make one change to the setting, which is an important one to allow the game to run as smooth as can be. For the hardware download mode, make sure to change the setting to disable rebacks, and once that's done you can enjoy Dragon Quest VIII with as much as 3 times upscaling using the standard quiet preset. This does break the sunray effect, but you can also choose to leave this setting at default, and we have enough power on hand here to brute force the issue with at least the native resolution and changing the performance presets. And that's pretty impressive stuff. And of course we gotta show some God of War 2, which is always a good performance benchmark for PlayStation 2 emulation. And God of War 2 does very well here with the Mini, and I am set to use 2 times the native resolution of PlayStation 2 with that standard performance preset and the Quiet Fan option, and this game gave me no troubles at all. We will be seeing some more Kratos in a little bit when he returns for the usual battery testing section. And as I mentioned earlier, I was just having a lot of fun going through the PlayStation 2 library, and an absolute gem of a game is Klonoa 2, which is a great 2.5D side-scrolling platformer that recently got a remaster collection released last year, which really makes me happy that the franchise is getting some attention. I am happy to report that Klonoa 2 is running very well here with Nether SX2, and I have it set to use 3 times the native resolution of the PlayStation 2, once again using that standard performance preset and the quiet fan option. So let's try out some more demanding games, and Shadow of the Colossus has always been another game that has been a good benchmark of PlayStation 2 emulation performance, and for this one I am set to use the native resolution using the standard performance preset with the quiet fan option. And so we do have some room to do a little bit of upscaling, but this is a pretty demanding game and the performance is still very impressive regardless, and it shows that despite the age of the Snapdragon 865, this is a chipset that can still handle quite a bit. Gran Turismo 4 is another game that really surprised me with its performance, and I tested both city tracks and rally tracks, and for both of those we were set to a 3 times native resolution of the PlayStation 2, and regardless of the type of track, Gran Turismo had no trouble staying at full speed, and it looks absolutely stunning at this resolution. I always get excited when I can go back and visit my hometown of New York City, as well as drive around my current hometown of Arizona and the Grand Canyon. Anyways, we do have some room to adjust settings here since we are at 3 times native upscaling, as well as just using that standard performance preset, and it's always great when we have a little bit of headroom to manipulate settings. Finally, I've got one last PlayStation 2 game that I wanted to show off, and it's one that I just haven't thought about in a little bit, and so I loaded up some Zone of the Enders 2, and this is a great game just to show off because it's a visually stunning game, but it also has so much happening on screen with lots of enemies, and so it's a pretty decent benchmark of PlayStation 2 emulation performance. For Zone of the Enders 2, I am set to use a 2 times native resolution, and once again still sticking to that standard performance preset with the quiet fan option, and the game is doing very well with these settings. There is no doubt about it, PlayStation 2 emulation is absolutely shining here on the Mini, and I do think that even for the more problematic games, we can potentially still brute force it with the performance that we still have on hand. And very briefly, I wanted to say that I did test the Android 10 build of the Suyu emulator, which is for Switch emulation, and again, it's one of those fun things to do, and I did test the lighter games like Celeste, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, and of course Sonic Mania, and all these games ran really well with the Suyu emulator, and so I think I'll be personally having a lot of fun just messing around with Switch emulation to see what it can actually do here. Now of course, if Retroid delivers that Android 13 build, then we won't need to use a special version of these emulators, which will definitely open the door for more compatibility. So as always, after all of this gaming, how does the Mini fare in terms of its battery life? And we do know that the Mini has a 4000 mAh battery, which is definitely going to be on the smaller side, but this Snapdragon 865 is a fairly efficient chipset, and so I think battery performance will be quite surprising to many. And as always, let's start out with my lighter test with Yoshi's Island, which I'm probably going to have to change to something else since a certain company has been on a little bit of a rampage. Yoshi's Island using the standard performance preset with 50% volume, 50% brightness, with the Wi-Fi turned off, Bluetooth turned off, and with the battery saver option on, which actually didn't impact gameplay at all, and the Mini was able to get about 15.5 hours of on-screen time, which is not bad for that 4000 mAh battery. And Kratos is back again for my usual battery testing on the higher end of emulation, and I have God of War 2 set to use 2 times the native resolution, using the standard performance preset with the quiet fan option at 50% volume, 50% brightness, with the Wi-Fi still turned off, Bluetooth turned off, and the Mini managed almost 4 hours of battery life, coming in at 3 hours and 45 minutes, which is pretty impressive. And again, if you were really concerned about battery life, you could always drop the resolution down to native to improve on battery performance slightly. I think given the size of the device and the size of the battery, this is pretty impressive performance. I also want to make a note of the standby performance, and so I put the Mini on standby when I went to bed and then turned the screen back on after about 10 hours, and the percentage dropped only about by 2%, which I think is very solid as well. Finally, I always like to record temperatures after having some on-screen time, and after about an hour of God of War 2 running, the Mini just barely went over 40 degrees Celsius at the spot that I would have expected, which is by the exhaust area, and shows that the hot air is moving out and away from the device. Otherwise, the temperature mostly stayed in the 30s, at least in the front portion where the display is, and on the back the temperatures were actually much cooler, especially where your hands go on the grips, staying in the high 20s, which is a very solid temperature and shows that the device is really not getting that hot, and that the active cooling is doing its job. It's important to note that this is with the quiet fan preset, and so I'd imagine that with either the smart or sport fan options, more air would move away from the device, and thus keeping it cooler. Now if you notice, I didn't talk about the Android interface with the Mini earlier on in this video, and that's because things will be changing for the Mini in the near future. Retroid is promising to bring Android 13 as well as Linux support to the Mini handheld, as soon as the end of this month, which is currently October. Now, as all things in life, I believe in a I believe it when I see it mentality, and so as long as you are okay with the Mini currently shipping with Android 10, then I say go for it. But if you are hoping or waiting for that Android 13 support, or potentially something like Batocera, I definitely recommend waiting for Retroid to deliver before pulling the trigger. But for what it's worth, I will say that I actually don't mind Android 10, and this build here is pretty stable with the usual things that I would expect, including performance preset adjustments, proper controller support, and of course support for Google Play services. So we have finally reached the end of this video, and there was a lot to cover here, so I do appreciate it if you did stick around to the end. I think it's very clear that the Mini has plenty of power under the hood to play most of what is available to emulate on the Android platform. The Mini clearly won't be for everybody, and for someone wanting a big screen experience, this is probably not going to be the right choice, which is why Retroid is launching the Retroid Pocket 5 later on in this month. But for someone looking for a compact device with a 4:3 aspect ratio display, the Mini is probably going to be the best you're going to get, especially with its beautiful OLED display that sets it apart from other compact handhelds despite the higher pricing. For fans of smaller devices, this is pretty much the nicest option that is now available. And I think that even coming from something like the Pocket 2S, there's enough here to warrant the premium pricing if you're looking for something that can do more. Regardless, we are fortunate to have all of these options, and speaking of those options, it won't be long before the Retroid Pocket 5 arrives, and so if you're interested in a widescreen handheld that has a larger screen but still ships with OLED, definitely keep an eye out. But until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.